Denis Davidov was a bold Russian warrior, poet, and rebel, a true adventurer who lived for battle and storytelling. He led daring guerrilla raids against Napoleon, changing Russia's military tactics forever. His poetry was wild and full of life, earning praise from great writers like Pushkin. Though his writings were censored, his legacy endured. This memoir, now fully translated into English for the first time, brings his thrilling first-hand stories to life, his battlefield victories, his fearless tactics, and his role in the Napoleonic Wars. A forgotten hero, finally rediscovered. These are his words. Let's begin. On the same day, at 6 o'clock in the evening, Lieutenant General Prince Lobanov-Rostovsky traveled to Tilsit for the armistice talks that were concluded on the 9th of June and ratified by Napoleon on the 10th. The most important articles of the agreement concerned the demarcation lines between the opposing armies through the middle of the river Niemen, the resumption of hostilities in 1858, the event of no accord between the negotiating parties, which was not to take place for a month, starting on the day when the truce was to be called off, the conclusion of an armistice with the Prussian army separate from that concluded with the Russian military, and the adoption of all possible measures to ensure a speedy conclusion of the final peace treaty. The last article was indispensable for Napoleon. Despite his victory at Friedland and his menacing position on the Niemen, his circumstances were actually not as favorable as they appeared. Ahead of him lay Russia, with its countless resources, but offering little or nothing to the enemy, limitless and unfathomable. Behind him was Prussia, a country without an army, but with a people whose national pride had been humiliated, driven to despair by the violence and coercion of its conquerors, not putting up any resistance because there was no rallying point, but anxiously awaiting an imminent uprising in Austria. For its part, Austria, shaken by the disasters at Ulm and Austerlitz, still had at its disposal an army numbering 340,000 men, ready for action, and whose 80,000-strong vanguard had already been moved to the northern borders of Bohemia and the area adjoining the lines of communication between Napoleon and France. This is the situation that troubled the great army commander at Tilsit and which required a speedy conclusion to the peace talks. Emperor Alexander was then not very far from the general headquarters of his army. On the 11th, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Napoleon sent his Marshal of the Palace, Duroc, to His Majesty, with congratulations and the official ratification of the armistice declaration. The emperor received Duroc very graciously and in turn ratified the document that he had handed him. Apparently, this was the occasion when the famous meeting of the emperors was agreed upon, a meeting which Napoleon seized upon for publicity reasons. It was to prove of no benefit to Alexander and was also to provoke the first of a series of mistakes which led to Napoleon's downfall, namely the uprising that began in Spain. The 13th was a solemn occasion and also a very curious day, because the demarcation line ran down the middle of the Niemen near the burned-down bridge. That is precisely where two pavilions were set up, very much like bathing platforms, square in shape and girded with white canvas. The larger one, more spacious and attractive, was intended for the two emperors. The smaller one was to house their retinues. They had been erected at Napoleon's order by General Lariboisière, who commanded his artillery. On the front of the larger pavilion facing us was an enormous letter A, and on the side, facing Tilsit, a letter N of the same size, neatly painted in green. Two large rowing boats were moored on opposite shores, ready to transport both monarchs and their retinue to these pavilions. The right bank of the Niemen, occupied by us, was a sloping meadow that was dominated by the hilly left bank in the hands of the French. This gave them an unimpeded view of our bank from the town to the surrounding hills, where the villages of Amt Baublin, Pogegen, and others stood, whereas we were unable to see anything except Tilsit, situated on the opposite ridge. But we had a good view of its occupants. We could identify the uniforms of the various units and admire, on either side of the main street, the old guard drawn up in several rows facing us, and all the way down to the bank of the Niemen. They were eagerly awaiting the appearance of their invincible leader, the all-powerful demigod, ready to greet him the moment he galloped down to the pier. On our side, there were no preparations made except for the rowing boat with the oarsmen, half a squadron of Chevalier Guards, and half a squadron of Prussian mounted guards to provide an escort for our emperor. These troops were arrayed on the bank of the river, with their right flank abutting the burned bridge and their left adjoining a once prosperous farmhouse called Obermammelschen Krug, which stood right on the shore at the point where the road from Tilsit to Amtboblin makes a turn. This farmhouse was chosen as a temporary shelter for Emperor Alexander, so that he could get to the boat and head for the pavilion on the river, no sooner and no later than Napoleon. There was no prettier building on the shore. Everything else had been dismantled for bivouac fires, and even this farmhouse was not much to look at. Instead of a roof, there were only beams left because the straw covering had been stripped by the troops to feed their horses, who were in need of both hay and straw. In the morning, some of the high-ranking generals rode over to Amtboblin, where the emperor had already arrived. Prince Bagration went there too, and because I was his adjutant and keen to witness such an extraordinary spectacle, I followed him, decked out in a rich-looking pelisse of the Life Guard regiment. Almost everyone was in parade uniform. The emperor was wearing the Preobrazhensky regiment's uniform of the style of that period. On either side of the collar were embroidered two small gold knots, very much like those they have nowadays, except much smaller, and without the present-day epaulets. He had on white pantaloons and short boots. His hairstyle was different from what is in vogue today. His hair was powdered white. He wore a high hat with a cockade and a black plume. A sword was at his side, a sash tied around his waist, and the blue ribbon of the Order of St. Andrew over his right shoulder completed Alexander's dress. Today, this outfit would seem a little odd, but at the time, it was much admired, especially on a handsome, slender, and agile 30-year-old man, as the late emperor then was. Around 11 o'clock in the morning, the emperor, the King of Prussia, the Grand Duke Constantine Pavlovich, Alexander's brother, and several generals designated to accompany the emperor on the boat got into carriages and headed for the shore along the Tilsit road. The other generals and their adjutants rode on either side. This procession was undoubtedly visible from Tilsit. At Obermammelschen Krug, the carriages stopped, and we all entered the large main room of the farmhouse. The emperor sat near the window facing the door. He put down his hat and gloves on a nearby table. The room filled up with generals who had followed his carriage. We adjutants came in after them and remained in the background near the door. My eyes did not leave the emperor. I felt that he was concealing, with an artificial calm and relaxed attitude, the true feelings that lay beneath the surface of his open, benevolent features. He was about to meet the greatest man of the time, a military leader, politician, lawgiver, and administrator, a man with a dazzling aura as a result of his astounding, almost legendary career. This was also the man who had conquered the whole of Europe in the last 2 years and defeated our army twice, and who now stood on the very borders of Russia. He was coming face to face with a man renowned for captivating people, endowed with an extraordinary ability to size up and take the measure of the character, feelings, and thoughts of his opponents. It was more than just an interview. Through this meeting, Alexander had to charm the charmer, seduce the seducer, and outwit an acknowledged genius. It was paramount to divert Napoleon's attention and direct his military activities towards some other enterprise, so remote as to provide Europe with additional time to clear away the suffocating rubble of war. It would also give Russia the opportunity to prepare the means to repel any future attempts against her independence, which, as our emperor foresaw, would sooner or later loom ahead. These were the concerns that occupied Alexander, mind and soul, and these are the goals that he achieved despite public opinion, ever swayed by appearances. No matter how you look at it, victory in this instance was squarely on his side. This is shown by the fact that Napoleon came to his senses only towards the end of 1809, when the obstinacy of the spirited Spaniards diverted a sizable portion of his forces away from the rest of Europe, and when we refused joint action with him against Austria in order to preserve the ties of friendship that would serve us well at the time of the Russian campaign. Barely half an hour had elapsed when someone came into the room and announced, "He is coming, Your Majesty." An electric spark of curiosity coursed through us all. The emperor rose nonchalantly and, without haste, picked up his hat and gloves and went outside with a calm face and measured step, We burst pell-mell from the room and dashed down to the shore to see Napoleon galloping at full speed between two ranks of his old guard. His escort and suite consisted of at least 400 men on horseback. The roar of enthusiastic greetings and shouts was deafening, even on the opposite bank of the Niemen. Almost simultaneously, both emperors boarded their boats. The Tsar was accompanied by Grand Duke Constantine, Bennigsen, Count Lieven, Prince Lobanov-Rostovsky, Uvarov, and Budberg, Minister of Foreign Affairs. Accompanying Napoleon were Murat, Bessières, Berthier, Duroc, and Caulaincourt. On that day, the King of Prussia did not come to the meeting. He remained on the right bank with us. Now both imperial boats left shore and got under way. At that moment, the enormity of the spectacle triumphed over every other feeling. All eyes were turned and fixed on the opposite shore, to the boat carrying this remarkable man, this commander whose likes had never been seen since the days of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, both of whom he greatly surpassed by the variety of his talents and his glorious conquests of civilized and cultured peoples. I looked at him through my spyglass, even though the distance separating us from the opposite shore was not great and was dwindling as the boat got closer to the pavilion set up in midstream. I saw Napoleon standing in front of the government officials who composed his suite, apart and silent. Time has erased from my memory the type of uniform he wore, and in my diaries, written hurriedly, I cannot find reference to it. But I do seem to remember that he wore not the usual chasseur uniform, but instead that of the old Imperial Guard. I do recall that he wore the Legion of Honor ribbon over his shoulder, and had on his head that little cocked hat familiar to the whole world. I was struck by the resemblance of his figure to all the images that were then sold by printmakers. He even stood with arms crossed over his chest exactly like in those pictures. Unfortunately, from lack of support, the spyglass wavered in my hands, and I could not see his features as clearly as I would have wished. Both boats reached the pavilion almost simultaneously. However, Napoleon's arrived a little sooner, so he had a few seconds in which to jump out and cross smartly through the pavilion to greet our emperor as he disembarked. Then, together, they entered the pavilion. As I recall, the members of either entourage did not go in, but remained on the raft, getting acquainted and conversing. After an hour or so, they were called inside to join the emperors. That is when Napoleon, having greeted and addressed each one in turn, spoke at greater length with Bennigsen. He said, among other things, "You were wicked at Eylau," commenting on the obstinacy and fury with which our armies had fought in this battle. And he concluded his conversation with the words, "I have always admired your talents, your prudence even more." The respected old warrior proudly construed this semi-epigram as a full-blown eulogy, because great commanders usually consider circumspection to be the least of military qualities, far beneath enterprise and bravery. This anecdote was told to me by Bennigsen several times, and each time with new pleasure. Because Napoleon had greeted Emperor Alexander when he alighted from his boat, etiquette required that Alexander duly accompany Napoleon to the boat on which he had arrived, and thus the first meeting was concluded. The French were exultant. The meetings of the emperors on the raft continued in the same vein, the only difference being that the Prussian king was invited to the last meeting, and some members of the imperial suites yielded their place to other officials. Eventually, both the Tsar and the King of Prussia were invited to set up residence in Tilsit, and their meetings with Napoleon continued there. At the same time, Napoleon arranged to move part of his guard out of Tilsit, and to prepare that part of the town to accommodate our guard. He set aside 2 of the best houses for the use of the other 2 monarchs. Around 6 o'clock in the evening, when Tsar Alexander moved to Tilsit, Napoleon met him at the shore as he alighted from the rowing boat. The whole imperial guard, mounted and on foot, stood on parade on either side of the main street, all the way from the jetty to Napoleon's residence, where the Tsar arrived on horseback together with his host. A table was laid for dinner, to which both the Grand Duke and Murat had been invited. The house reserved for the Tsar was located on the main street and was about 200 yards from the one occupied by Napoleon. It was a 2-story structure, but not very large, with a narrow main entrance adorned by 4 columns. The door on this side was directly off the street, with 3 or 4 steps between the 2 central columns, leading through a fairly spacious hallway to the downstairs rooms on either side of an attractive flight of stairs that ascended to the upper floor occupied by our emperor. Here, there was a salon on the right, a connecting room in the middle, and the Tsar's bedroom on the left. The connecting room opened onto a balcony supported by the external columns. Other than the Russian Imperial Guard that was quartered in Tilsit under the command of Vorontsov, Levashov, and Reitern, no one from the regular Russian or Prussian armies was allowed to come to Tilsit. This excluded adjutants who went back and forth on business between the army and imperial headquarters, and I, of course, did not fail to take advantage of this privilege. However, the desire to gawk at Napoleon overcame all these obstacles. Many of our generals, staff officers, and others dressed themselves in civilian clothes and managed to stay in Tilsit for several days. After a long and arduous campaign, the town seemed to them like a sort of earthly paradise. To be candid, however, although both sides wanted to display harmony and an eagerness to please that fell just short of friendship, it was an uneasy relationship in which neither was really prepared to modify its normal habits. Day followed day monotonously. At 12 or 1 o'clock, there was lunch. At 6 o'clock, Emperor Alexander rode on his horse to see Napoleon with a small escort, or Napoleon would come to visit him with an enormous entourage and a huge escort. Then they would go and watch maneuvers of some French troops, or the Imperial Guard and its components of Davout's corps. It is worth noting that despite the small distance to Tilsit, the corps under the command of Marshal Lannes was never presented to and reviewed by Emperor Alexander, because it consisted only of fragments that were left after the losses incurred at Heilsberg and Friedland. After the maneuvers, Napoleon usually invited Alexander over to his house, where they had dinner together. Later that night, at 10 or 11, Napoleon would almost always call on Alexander, simply as a friend, on foot and without entourage or escort, in that famous hat and grey overcoat, at the sight of which the earth trembled. Both hat and overcoat seemed to have battle smoke clinging to them, even on friendly occasions. Napoleon would then have a cup of tea there and remain chatting with our emperor until 1 or sometimes 2 o'clock in the morning. The Prussian king moved to Tilsit on the 10th, and from then on often spent time with Napoleon and Alexander, except for the late-night chats. The Queen of Prussia arrived on the 25th, only 2 days before peace was concluded. Everything that took place openly was obviously witnessed by many apart from myself, and it must be hoped that someone else will fill in the gaps and correct what I forgot or reported incorrectly. Regrettably, no one can describe much more important events, such as the conversations of the two emperors in their first private meetings in the pavilion on the raft, and their subsequent late-night chats. All this took place without witnesses, so that there was no historian to record it. What a terrible loss. Having some right to visit Tilsit, I begged Prince Bagration for permission to go there as often as possible. The prince, such a strict and exacting superior in everything that concerned military service, was quite indulgent and helpful to his subordinates in other circumstances. He agreed to my request and sent me almost daily with errands for various people living in Tilsit. This gave me the opportunity to see Napoleon almost on a daily basis, often standing a couple of steps away from him. To avoid repetition, I will only describe my first meeting with Napoleon. The others that followed were quite similar and do not merit special mention. I don't remember the exact date, but only recall that shortly after the emperor moved to Tilsit, Prince Bagration sent me with a message to one of the officials at imperial headquarters. I put on my parade uniform of the Life Guard Hussars and crossed the Niemen by rowing boat. The person I was supposed to see was in an upstairs salon of the emperor's house. There I found Prince Kurakin and Prince Lobanov-Rostovsky, who were the official representatives at the peace talks, as well as the Prussian Field Marshal Kalkreuth, fresh from the spirited defense of Danzig, and a multitude of ministers and other government officials. While I was there, Caulaincourt came in with a courtly yet haughty and insolent air. He had been sent by Napoleon to invite our emperor to attend maneuvers at 6 o'clock and dinner afterward. Thereafter, when he was the French ambassador in St. Petersburg, his pomposity and aloofness became even more intolerable. But God, you should have seen him 8 years later in Paris on the morning of our triumphal entrance into that capital. Shortly after 5 p.m., I was already at the main entrance of the Tsar's residence. Within less than a half hour, we heard the clatter of a large group of cavalry, and I saw a crowd of horsemen galloping down the main street towards the house of His Majesty. It was Napoleon, surrounded by his retinue and escort. The crowd that accompanied him must have numbered at least 300 people. At their head galloped chasseurs à cheval. After them came other officers adorned with gold braid crosses, followed by staff officers mingled with court officials richly attired in various outfits. Behind this cavalcade came dozens of chasseurs from another military unit. In the middle of this long column, surrounded by marshals, rode Napoleon himself. Now they had reached the house entrance. One of the two pages who always attended him was named Marescol, the son of a general in the engineer corps, a handsome youngster of 17, dressed in a hussar brown dolman and tricorn hat. He dismounted, grabbed Napoleon's horse, and ran so quickly up the entrance steps and past me up the stairs, leading to the emperor's private quarters, that I barely had time to spot him. He was followed by the marshals and staff officers, but the rest of the official retinue and escort remained in the saddle outside. Murat, who was following Napoleon, met the Grand Duke, engaged him in conversation, and I stayed behind. I gazed for a long time at this Murat, undoubtedly one of the most brilliant and brave cavalry leaders in Europe. His handsome stature and features, his carnival costume, worn with the coquetry and deliberation of a stylish beauty, captured every eye. He was known to dress up even more elaborately and magnificently when engaged in more dangerous activities. But for all his chivalrous spirit and showy appearance, his talents were displayed mainly in the fury of battle, commanding and handling masses of cavalry under Napoleon's orders. Marescot came to the door and stopped near me, entrusting Napoleon's horse to a colorfully dressed stable official by the entrance steps. I remember that it was a small bay horse, but of pure Arabian stock with a long tail. The saddle was of crimson velvet, the bit and stirrups were of solid gold. Suddenly there was a commotion at the top of the stairs. The marshals and adjutants came down quickly to get to their horses, but Marescot headed them off. He rushed to retrieve Napoleon's horse from the stable official and grabbed it by the bridle as before. The proud courtier and former republican, Caulaincourt, dressed in rich palace finery with 2 stars on his breast, was holding the stirrup with one hand, the whip in the other, awaiting the arrival of his lord and master. Napoleon emerged from the hall and paused at the entrance next to Emperor Alexander. The doorway was so narrow, and he was so close to me that I had to back away for fear of jostling him accidentally. He was busy telling the Tsar something in a jovial, impulsive manner. I heard nothing. I was all eyes, devouring him visually, trying to memorize all the features, all his changes of expression, all his mannerisms. By good fortune, as if to indulge me, he became even more talkative and paused near me for more than 2 minutes. I was content, but not entirely. I had to get a closer look at the color of his eyes, and as if on purpose, he suddenly looked right at me. His glance was so direct that in any other circumstance I would have lowered my eyes, but my curiosity overcame everything. His eyes met mine in a hard, unwavering gaze. Then he turned to the Tsar again, replying to some question that had been asked, put on his hat, mounted his horse, spurred it on, and galloped off at full speed the way he had come. All this happened in a flash, without pause. At the same instant, everything behind, around, and ahead of him erupted, and this incredible prodigy, like a brilliant, exploding meteor, vanished from view. I have already remarked on how much I was struck by the overall resemblance of Napoleon to the prince on sale everywhere. But the same was not true of his facial features. None of the portraits that I had seen bore the least resemblance to him. Believing them, I had supposed that Napoleon sported a rather large hooked nose, dark eyes, and dark hair. In a word, the true Italian facial type. In fact, his face was slightly swarthy, with regular features. His nose was not very large, but straight, with a very slight, hardly noticeable bend. The hair on his head was not black, but dark reddish blonde. His eyebrows and eyelashes were much darker than the color of his hair, and his blue eyes, set off by the almost black lashes, gave him a most pleasing expression. Finally, no matter how many times I had occasion to see him, I never noticed those frowning eyebrows with which the portrait pamphleteers endowed him. The man I saw was of short stature, just over 5 feet tall, rather heavy, although he was only 37 years old and despite the fact that the lifestyle he followed should not, on the face of it, have led him put on much weight. He held himself erect without the least effort, as is common with all short people. But what was peculiar to him alone was a nobility of bearing and an urbane martial air, which undoubtedly was derived from the habit of commanding men and a consciousness of moral superiority. No less remarkable were the ease and frankness of his approach, his natural dexterity, and the quickness of his movements. On that day, and those that followed, he wore the dark green chasseur uniform with gold epaulets of a colonel, without stars. He also wore a star and a small cross of the Legion of Honor. His linen was dazzling white, and he sported jackboots that came above the knee, with small gold spurs and a dress sword at his side. He held his hat in his hand and did not put it on until he mounted his horse. On 25th June, the peace was finally concluded. Our troops headed back to Russia. Prince Bagration made for St. Petersburg, and I accompanied him. Our rest period did not last long. The following January, we joined the troops fighting in Finland. I am reminded here of the words of my friend and military comrade, the unforgettable General Kulnev. Our mother Russia is wonderful because there is always some corner of the empire where people are fighting. And there was to be another corner that witnessed hostilities, Turkey, where the prince and I were called upon to appear after military action came to a close in Finland. That concludes the 6th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy this type of content.